Peace, peace, peace. What's up? What's up? Hope all is good. Good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hope you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic week. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our live weekly YouTube readings of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. So good to see all of you this Thursday evening. Of course, this is the only live reading of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force on YouTube. The final report of the first in the nation Reparations Task Force is one of, if not the most important government reports about the Black American community since the 1960s. Equally important, it's also the foundation for current and future reparations legislation right here in California. The report is nearly 1,100 pages long, about 1,046 pages long, and we're bringing every page of it to you, chapter by chapter, every week, right here on YouTube on Thursdays, so that you are properly educated in your advocacy for reparations in California. Today's reading of the final report is presented to you as a community service with support from the Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team at the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California. CJEC is California's leading grassroots reparations organization. We were born for reparations and reparative justice for Black American freedmen living in California. For more info on CJEC and our work helping to enact the law that created the California Reparations Task Force, California's law requiring state agencies to start to collect data on descendants of U.S. slavery, the act to end current slavery going on right now in California state prisons, the California Freedmen Affairs Bill, and more, visit www.cjec-official.org. Before we go any further, right now, I need you to do three things for me. First, connect to our YouTube channel by liking this video right now. Like this video right now. Hit that bell for reminders as well. And of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Second, get connected to us on social media by following CJEC on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter at CJEC Official. Of course, we also want you to, and finally, that is, get informed and get involved. Visit www.cjec-official.org to sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page, and support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the homepage of our website. And a big special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. You can learn all about the amazing work that our fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project, does by visiting their website at www.cabwhp.org. By way of introduction, of course, my name is Chris Lodgson. For those who don't know, I live in Sacramento, California. You could probably already tell I'm from somewhere else. I'm from New York City originally, and I'm a volunteer reparations advocate with CJEC's Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team. The agenda for today, Chapter 17, Part 2 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. The title of the chapter we're reading tonight is Final Recommendations. Final Recommendations. So Chapter 17 starts the part of the report that just talks about what the task force is recommending for reparations. So the first half of the report, chapters 1 through 16, are all of the things that the task force learned, are all of the historical record, are all of the evidence needed to support the recommendations for reparations. And so chapter 17 starts the reparations recommendations, and we're reading part 2 of chapter 17. You can find part 1 of chapter 17 right here on our YouTube channel. Just go to the live video section Just a quick heads up, there was some audio clicking going on in the reading of part 1 of chapter 17. So most likely we will upload a new version of chapter 17. You can still hear it. It's pretty clear, but we want to make sure that you get the best quality, the best sound, the best audio possible, because this is important stuff. So we will probably upload a new version, probably a recorded version that's new of chapter 17, part 1. So stay tuned for that. You can follow along in the reading yourself, download tonight's chapter or the full final report of the State Reparations Task Force by going to our website, again, of course, cjec-official.org/reports. Okay, we're about ready to start our reading, but before we do, I have some special things and some special announcements to make. First, as always, I'd like to thank our good friends at ETM Media Group on YouTube for their live reading of the first report of the California Reparations Task Force. You can watch and or listen to their readings of the first report of the California Reparations Task Force, which came out about a year or so ago on their channel at ETM Media Group right here on YouTube, and also on our website at www.cjec-official.org/video. Second, for those of you who don't know, historic reparations legislation in California is here now, and more is coming. For example, SB or Senate Bill 490 is California's first lineage-based reparations-related legislation to establish the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, which is what you could think of as the reparations agency. So this would be the place where folks go to show that they're eligible for reparations, apply for reparations, process their claims for reparations, and get direct services specifically to the descendant community. The bill, SB 490, was introduced recently by State Senator and California Reparations Task Force member Stephen Bradford, and will move forward in 2024. To read the bill, visit, of course, our website, cjec-official.org/advocacy, and learn as much as you can about SB Senate Bill 490. It's historic reparations legislation. Third, as mentioned, more historic reparations bills and legislation are coming over the next several months. More reparations bills will be written during the 2024 legislation session. We'll see those bills be introduced and then start to move toward passage by majorities of both the California State Assembly and State Senate. To pass reparations bills in 2024, we need 41 Assembly members to vote yes and 21 senators to vote yes. When those bills are passed, we then need our governor to sign those bills. So to make reparations real in California, the math is 41 plus 21 plus 1. That's 41 assembly members plus 21 senators plus 1 governor. 41 plus 21 plus 1 equals reparations in California in 2024. Lastly, but not least, a special thanks to CJEC's organizing and mobilizing team, and specifically our volunteer report readers and our guest readers who are going to be coming on and giving us some special readings from organizations like Bend the Arc, NorCal chapter, Rising Communities. By the way, I want to give a big shout out to Rising Communities for an amazing, fantastic futures policy forum yesterday in Los Angeles. It was an amazing event. I had the privilege, the pleasure, the honor, the blessing of hosting the reparations panel, moderating the reparations panel. And we had folks from the California Reparations Task Force. We had 3 California Reparations Task Force members on the panel with us yesterday. We had Chair of the State Reparations Task Force, Camilla Moore, State Reparations Task Force member and sitting San Diego City Council member, Monica Montgomery Stepp, and former California Reparations Task Force member, professor at LMU, PhD psychologist, Dr. Cheryl Grills, also on the panel with us yesterday, as well as Trevor Smith from Liberation Ventures, who runs the narrative. He's the director of narrative change at Liberation Ventures. And of course, we also had, who was the other? Oh, we had, how could I forget? Excuse me. How could I forget the one and only Friday Jones, Vice Chair of the Los Angeles African American Reparations Commission. This was a dope panel. Shout out to Rising Communities, a tremendous, amazing partner with us who we've been doing amazing work with for over a year. So big shout out to Rising Communities, and big shout out to the guest readers who are going to be coming on from Rising Communities to help us read this California Reparations final report. And without further ado, Chapter 17, Part 2 of the California Reparations Task Force's final report. And we're going to start on page 615. So 615 is where we're starting. 613, 614 are tables and graphs. And so we're going to start under the first graph on page 615. Though the figures above measure the harm perpetrated by over-incarceration through the number of African-American Californians disproportionately arrested for drug felonies, this system of discriminatory arrest was ultimately directed at the entire African-American community and affects all descendants who lived in the state during the war on drugs from 1971 to 2020. For example, people in neighborhoods targeted for the war on drugs may avoid encounters with the police lest they be treated as suspects and potentially be subject themselves to police violence. This may interfere with legitimate law enforcement investigations and may lead to elevated levels of unresolved crime. This, in turn, would reduce the quality of life and depress property values, which in turn would lead to underfunded schools in the neighborhood and so on. The whole neighborhood and community may suffer from disproportionate policing as a result of the war on drugs. Thus, all those who are eligible should be compensated for lost quality of life due to racial profiling and biased law enforcement. To apportion the overall losses resulting from the war on drugs in California, the task force's experts divided the sum of $227,858,891,023 among the estimated 1,976,911 non-Hispanic African American residents who lived in the state in 2020, for an estimated loss per recipient totaling $115,260 in 2020 dollars, or about $2,352 for each year of residency in California during the 49-year period, 1971 through 2020. Atrocity 3, housing discrimination. As detailed in Chapter 5, Housing Discrimination, federal, state, and local government officials discriminated against and segregated African American residents throughout California from the beginning of the state's founding. Individual participants in the housing market discriminated against African American buyers or renters. Local zoning rules enforced segregation, and the state allowed this discrimination to occur even though the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. As a result, in 2019, a year before the Reparations Task Force was established, African American Californians controlled far less of the state's average per capita housing wealth than did white Californians. The task force presents two potential methods to calculate the losses due to housing discrimination. The first calculates all monetary losses due to racial housing discrimination by calculating the average per capita to white to African American home ownership wealth gap in 2019 and compounding interest on that gap until 2022. However, critics may object to that by sweeping in all forms of housing discrimination. And this method does not focus on discrete forms of housing discrimination by state actors. So the second method offered here calculates monetary losses specifically due to redlining. As discussed in Chapter 5, Housing Discrimination and Segregation, redlining is a clear case of state-sanctioned housing discrimination beginning with the New Deal in 1933 and lasting 44 years or so until the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, formally, although not effectively, sought to combat the persisting effects of redlining. We're reading live here, okay? As you're hearing stuff in the background. While redlining denied federally insured affordable mortgages to those in African American neighborhoods, based on federal law, California could have insured redlined homes in places of the federal government, to address this injustice in a timely fashion. But not only did California not engage in any policies to ameliorate or improve the effect of federal redlining, it embraced redlining policies and other policies discriminating against African American Californians. Local zoning laws discriminated against African Americans in every corner of the United States, including California, with, quote, zoning rules decreeing separate living areas for Black and white families, prohibiting African Americans from buying homes on blocks where whites were a majority, and vice versa. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruled these expressly discriminatory zoning laws unconstitutional in 1917, but this ruling was often ignored by government entities as well as individuals. In addition, as described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, the discriminatory government policy of redlining has created devastating and persisting consequences for African American communities. Though redlining was instituted through federal law, that policy shaped home ownership through bank financing. And banks in this country have long been subject to a, quote, dual banking system, end quote, subject to parallel state and federal regulation. Thus, California's parallel duty to regulate banks gave it the authority to treat African Americans equitably, encourage residential integration, and to provide state-level insurance for mortgages purchased by residents in redline areas ineligible for federally insured mortgages. Instead, California failed to act until decades later, sanctioning or maintaining redlining discrimination against its African American residents, giving the state a responsibility to then redress intergenerational wealth harms resulting from housing discrimination in California. Before the federal government began insuring mortgages in 1933, home ownership, quote unquote, remained prohibitively expensive for working and middle-class families. Bank mortgages typically required 50% down, interest-only payments, and repayment in full after 5 to 7 years, at which point the borrower would have to refinance or find another bank to issue a new mortgage with similar terms. These remained the conditions for African American borrowers even after 1933, while white borrowers, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, not only subsidized the mortgages with much lower interest rates, the HOLC also rescued and refinanced white families' existing mortgages subject to imminent foreclosures, issuing them new mortgages with repayment schedules of up to 15 years, which was later extended to 25 years. In addition, HOLC mortgages were amortized, meaning that when the loan was paid off, white borrowers would own the home. Since African American home buyers were excluded from government-insured mortgages, they depended on traditional financing models with much more expensive or risky conditions. to the extent that they could even attempt to afford a home that would otherwise have been heavily subsidized for a white home buyer. The result was a growing racial home ownership gap. Given the financial consequences of redlining, two scholars have proposed the following loss estimation procedure. Quote, the difference in mean household wealth attributable to home ownership multiplied by the number of African American, end quote, households in California. The task force's experts agree that this formula, quote, provides a reasonable estimate of the aggregate debt resulting from housing and lending discrimination, end quote. So this report offers two potential ways to perform that calculation here. One, using 2019 data to estimate losses due primarily to all forms of housing discrimination until the present, or two, using 1930 and 1980 data to estimate losses due primarily to redlining. Method one, estimating financial losses due to all forms of housing discrimination until the present. In 2019, 1 year before the legislature enacted AB Assembly Bill 3121, and 1 year before the COVID-19 pandemic, the average African American non-Hispanic home in California had a value of about $593,200. And the average white non-Hispanic home had a value of about $773,400. At the time, about 36.8% of the African American Californian households owned their own home, while 63.2% of white Californian households did, reflecting a home ownership gap of 26.4 percentage points. Wow. Using 2019 census figures for the average number of people living in African American and white California households, the experts estimated the total wealth and home values controlled collectively by African American and white Californians. 2,213,986 divided by 2.44 equaling 907,371. So the 2,213,986 represents the number of African Americans living in California in 2019. And then we divide that by 2.44, which is the average number of African Americans per household in California in 2019, to arrive at 907,371 African American households in California. 14,364,928 divided by 2.36 equals 6,086,834. So the 14,364,928 represents the number of white Americans living in California in 2019. And we divide that by the number 2.36, which represents the average number of white Americans per household in California in 2019, to arrive at 6,886,834 white households in California. The experts then estimated the total wealth in homes controlled in 2019 collectively by all African American, non-Hispanic California households, and the total wealth in homes controlled in 2019 collectively by all white Californian households. So the math on that is 593,200 times 907,371 times 0.36, which equals $198,076,911,610. So the $593,200 is the average value of African American homes in California. And then you multiply that by the 907,371, which are the number of African American households in California. And then you multiply that by 0.368 to arrive at $198,076,911,610 in home ownership wealth owned by African American and Californians in 2019. Then we do this math: $773,400 times 6,086,834 times 0.632 to arrive at $2,997,176,286. The $773,400 is the average value of white homes in California. I think this was in 2019 also. Then you multiply that by the 6,086,834 white households in California, and then divide that, and then multiply that rather by 0.632 to arrive at $2,975,176,286 in home ownership wealth owned by white Californians in 2019. After calculating the total housing wealth controlled by each of the two racial groups, which is the math exercise that we just did, the experts computed the estimated per capita amount held by each group, including those who do not own homes due to housing discrimination. So the math on that is 198 million, billion with a B, 76,911,610 divided by 2,213,986 to arrive at about 89,476. So the 189 billion figure divided by the 2,213,000 figure represents the amount of wealth controlled by African American Californians who own homes divided by the number of African Americans in California generally, even those who don't own homes. And the answer to that division is $89,466, which is the per capita African American Californian home ownership wealth. The experts then took the number of I said before it was 2 billion. Sorry, that's 2 trillion. 2,975,176,286,659. Wow. So the white home ownership value in California, I said earlier, was 2 billion. It's 2,975,176,286,659. Wow. Divided by 14,364,928 to equal a number of $207,114. So that $2 trillion number, that's what I just said. That's the amount of wealth controlled by white homeowners in California in 2019. And then the 14 million is the number of white homeowners in California. The number of white homeowners in California, right? To arrive at $207,114 per capita white Californian home ownership wealth. Wow. So comparing the two shows an estimated per capita home ownership wealth gap of about $117,648 in 2019. Adding a compounded annual 30-year mortgage interest rate, about 3.10% in 2020, the African American and white home ownership gap in California in 2020 is approximately $121,295 in 2020 dollars. Wow. So while this figure represents the cumulative effect of all sources of discrimination, individual level, so homeowners, real estate agents, etc., corporate, banks, and local zoning boards, as well as state and federal redlining, it represents a cautious estimate because it assumes that reparations for de jure discrimination, i.e. redlining, should not have been paid earlier, for example, after 1977, when the federal government passed a law attempting to counteract the persisting effects of redlining. Okay, so that all that was method one. All that was the first method for calculating what the dollar amount in losses to our people have been for what harms were done to us in the housing market. So that was the first method. All that math was the first method of calculating what is the dollar amount of losses to our community, specifically the descendants, for what was done to us harmfully in the housing market. And so all that was the first method. Now we're going to talk about the second method. Okay, so method two, estimating financial losses due primarily to redlining. So the first method estimated losses for all kinds of housing discrimination, zoning laws, what real estate agents and brokers did, what the home ownership loan corporations did, everything, all of the different types, including redlining, all of the different types of housing related harms and discrimination specifically on us as a people. This method, method two, specifically and only estimates financial losses due primarily to redlining. So this is only about redlining. Okay, so let's go through method two, and thank you for being with us. I know it's a lot of math, but this is very, very important. This is how we came to the dollar amounts of financial compensation that the task force is recommending. So the task force is recommending a certain amount of compensation financially to those who are eligible for reparations. All this chapter is about is telling us how the task force actually came up with those numbers. So it's a lot of math, but it's important math. It's probably the most important math that some of us are ever going to do in our lives, outside of balancing our budgets and our families, and that's, our sort of family stuff, right? So, okay, let's go through method two. Okay, so alternatively, the legislature could estimate the financial losses due to housing discrimination by calculating losses due primarily to redlining. This process follows a similar method to the one used above, but uses data instead from 1930, 3 years before the start of federal redlining in 1933, and 1980, 3 years after the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 formally sought to end private lending practices that reproduced redlining. While the task force would ideally use data from 1933 and 1977 to perform this calculation, at the time of this report, relevant data from those years is unavailable, and the task force relies instead on data from the nearest decennial censuses, 1930 and 1980. In 1930, African American homes in California had a mean value of about $4,535. And white homes in California had a mean value of about $6,067. Let me just make sure I read that right. In 1930, okay, in 1930, that's why those numbers sound low. In 1930, African American homes in California had a mean value of $4,535. Wow. And white homes in California had a mean value of $6,067. Again, this is in 1930, okay, almost 100 years ago. Okay? Reflecting a $1,532 difference between the two. That year, there were 22,595 African American households and about 1,482,203 white households in California. At that time, in California, about 37.6% of African Americans own their own home versus about 48.2% of white Americans, revealing a home ownership gap of about 10.6%. From this data, the task force's experts estimated the total wealth held in home values collectively by African Americans and white Californians. The task force's experts estimated the total wealth in homes held in each year. For 1930, the math is 4,535 times 22,595 times 0.36, which equals about $38,528,090. So the 4,538, That's the mean value of an African-American home in California in 1930. The 22,595 represents the number of African-American households in California in 1930. And then you divide that number, or excuse me, you multiply those numbers by 0.376 to arrive at a dollar value of about $38,528,090 total for African-American wealth in California homes in 1930. So the entire wealth of African-American homes, if you add them all up in 1930, was about $38,528,090. Okay? And so that's the first piece of the calculation. The second piece. So we just did that for African Americans, for Black Americans, for Black folks in California in 1930. We're gonna do that same type of calculation for white Americans, white families, white Californians in 1930 also. So the math is you take 6,076, that number, and you multiply that by 1,482,203, and then you multiply all of those by the number 0.482 to arrive at a dollar value of, and I'm gonna try to read this right, okay? Because I've been mixing up millions and billions and trillions. So 4,334,397,340. Got it right. Okay. 4,397,340,340,000. Okay. And make sure I got that right. Hold on. So 4 billion. Okay. So that's 4 billion rather, not trillion, 4,334,397,340. So all that math right there equals a dollar value amount of $4,334,397,340. Okay. It's a lot of money. Those are big numbers, a lot of commas. All right. Now, so let's break down what those numbers actually are. So the 6,067, which is the first number that we multiplied or that we use to multiply, that represents the mean value. And when we say mean value, think of the mean as a different kind of average. Okay? So the way to think about the mean is it's a different kind of average. So there are different kinds of averages. The kind of average that we normally think about is, the sort of, take everything, you add it up, and then you divide it by the number of the things that you added up. The mean is a different kind of average. So it's another way of figuring out a kind of average. Okay. So when we say mean, think of average, even though they're not exactly the same. Okay. But it's close. Okay. So $6,067 was the mean or close to average value of a white home in California in 1930. Okay? So that's the first factor, first piece that we're using to do this math. Okay. Then the second piece, the second factor is the 1,482,203 number. That number represents the number of white households in California in 1930. Okay. So you multiply those two numbers, then you multiply all of that, whatever you get from that, by 0.482 to arrive at, and I'm gonna get this number right, 4,334,397,340 in total white wealth in California homes in 1930. Okay. So we've got a number for the total white wealth in California homes in 1930, and we have a dollar amount for the total African American wealth in California homes in 1930. Step 2. Calculating the total wealth held by each of the two racial groups, they then computed the estimated wealth per capita. Per capita means per person in each group, whether they owned a home or not. Okay. So how do they do that, right? So how do they figure out the per person total wealth held by a person in each group? How do they do that math? Here is the math. So they took the number 38,528,090 and divided that number by 81,048 to arrive at a dollar amount per capita or per person of about $475. So the 38,528,090 number represents the total African American wealth in California homes in 1930. And that's the number that we came up with earlier. And then the 81,048 number represents the number of African Americans in California in 1930. So when you divide those two numbers, you get $475 of African American per capita, per person wealth in California homes in 1930. Very important math. Okay? Secondly, they then multiplied, or they then divided rather, the number 4,334,397,340 by 5,408,260 to arrive at a number of about $801. So that 4 billion number, that's the total white wealth in California homes in 1930. That 5 million number that we divided by, that's the number of white Americans in California in 1930. And when you do that division, you get about $801 of white per capita wealth in California homes in 1930. So we have a dollar figure for the amount of African American per capita wealth in California homes in 1930, and we have a dollar amount for white per capita wealth in California homes in 1930. So all that math was to get those two numbers. What's the white per capita wealth in California homes in 1930? What is the African American per capita wealth in California homes in 1930? We have those two numbers now. Then taking the difference between the two, 801 and 475, results in an estimated per capita African American white home value gap of about $326 in 1930 dollars, favoring white Californians. This gap represents the unequal starting positions for African Americans and white Californians, even before the federal government massively subsidized white home ownership while excluding African American applicants through, of course, things like the New Deal and the GI Bill. The experts then repeated this calculation with data from 1980, 3 years after the federal government attempted to end the effects of redlining through the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. And again, keep in mind that we're using 1930 and 1980 to represent the era of redlining. Let's say this is the era of redlining, so 1930 to 1980. So, because the 1980 census did not provide a breakdown of white or African American per household in California, the experts calculated this figure by dividing the total number of white and African American Californians by the mean or average number of white Americans and African Americans per household that year. So there wasn't enough data in the 1980 census to get a breakdown of white or African Americans per household in California. So all this says is that the experts figured out a way to estimate what that number should be. And here's how they did it. So they took the number 1,819,281, and then they divided that by the number 3.67 to arrive at a number of 495,717. The 1,819,000 number represents the number of African Americans in California in 1980, and the 3.67 number represents the average number of African Americans per household in 1980. And that number, when you divide those two, that number equals 495,717 African American California households in 1980. Okay. Piece one. That's piece number one. That's the first piece. The experts then took the number 18,030,893, divided that number by 3.22 to arrive at a number of about 5,599,656. Where does the 18 million number come from? That number represents the number of white Americans in California in 1980. Where does the 3.22 come from? That represents the average number of white Americans per household in 1980. When you do that division, that number, the number that you get is 5,599,656, which represents the number of white American California households in 1980. Okay. So in 1980, the average African American non-Hispanic Californian home was worth about $66,670. and the average white non-Hispanic California home was worth an estimated $100,516 in 1980 dollars. So the California home ownership gap in 1980 amounted to about 20.1 percentage points, with 40.6% of Black homes being owner occupied and 60.7% of white homes being owner occupied. So let's take the next step and do a little bit more math to figure out what is the actual home ownership wealth gap per person or per capita in 1980. Once we get that, then we're going to compare that to what we got for the 1930 numbers. Again, this is a lot of math. It's important math because this is how we came up with the numbers for how much the eligible community in California is due. So the task force made some recommendations about how much is due, or a better way to say it is how much was lost from our people, how much was stolen from our people, how much was taken in wealth from our peoples, just specifically right now due to the housing related harm, specifically redlining. And so this chapter and specifically this section is about how did we come up with those specific numbers. So let's do a little bit more math. So the next equation is you take the number 66,670, you multiply that by 495,717, and then you multiply all of that by 0.406 to arrive at a number of 13,000, excuse me. Okay, let me get this right because I've been messing up the billions and trillions. So 13,418,077,670. Okay, I got that right. 13,418,077,670. So where do these numbers come from? So the 66,670 number that we first started with to do the multiplication, that represents the average value of an African-American home in California in 1980. The 495,717 number represents the number of African-American households in California in 1980. And then we multiply all that by the number 0.406 to arrive at the number 13,418,077,670 in total home ownership wealth of African Americans in California in 1980. Okay. So that's for us. That's for our people. That's for African Americans. That's for the descendant community. Then we're going to do that same math for white non-Hispanic Californians also to arrive at or to figure out what is the total home ownership wealth of white Americans in California in 1980. So we take the number 100,516, multiply that by 5,599,656, and then whatever number you get from that, you then multiply all that by the number 0.607 to arrive at the number of, let me say this slowly, 341,652,998,655. So 341,652,998,655. And that represents the total home ownership wealth of white Americans in California in 1980. So divided by the entire African American population in California in 1980 and the entire white population in California in 1980, respectively, each of these estimates yields the per capita wealth in homes held by each group. And so all that math was just to figure out how much wealth was owned by each group per person in whatever year we were talking about. So whether it was 1930 or 1980. The estimated average per capita African-American wealth in California homes in 1980 amounted to about $7,375. And the estimated per capita white home ownership wealth in California homes amounted to about $18,948. And again, this is per person. Per capita means per person. In short, while Californians' per capita home wealth was $11,573 in 1980 dollars, greater than that of African Americans in California. So let me say that again. In short, white Californians' per capita home wealth was about $11,573 greater than that of African American Californians. And again, this is in 1980 dollars. Okay. So to identify how much of the 1980 per capita home ownership wealth gap was due to California's complicity in federal redlining discrimination, the 1930 per capita home ownership wealth gap can be subtracted from the 1980 value. After adjusting the 1930 per capita home ownership wealth gap into its equivalent purchasing power in 1980 dollars, subtracting the 1930 per capita home ownership wealth gap from the 1980 per capita home ownership wealth gap, 11,500 minus 1,483, results in a redlining per capita wealth gap of $10,090, and that's per capita, that's per person, quantifying how much African American Californians lost in home ownership wealth due to federal redlining discrimination and California's complicity in this policy. So, compounding that $10,090 per capita up to $2020 using an annual 30-year mortgage interest rate yields a per capita value of about $161,508 in 2020 dollars lost per person. Wow. In other words, the task force's experts team calculates that discriminatory redlining, specifically redlining here, facilitated by the state of California, caused the average African American in California to lose about $161,508 in home ownership wealth. To estimate a hypothetical amount California might have to pay to make up only for redlining, the expert team multiplied the average loss to African American Californians due to redlining with the number of African Americans living in the state in 1980. While the task force recommends reparations payments to a defined eligible class specifically because the U.S. Census does not currently identify individuals in a manner that would allow them to be categorized in this way, although that will be changing, this report uses the number of census respondents who identified as Black or African Americans alone as a rough estimate. So to get a rough estimate of what the big dollar value is, they use the current census way of classifying folks, although the task force, as it says here, recommends that reparations payments be for the eligible class only. And so this is a rough estimate, the number that we're going to talk about now. So multiplying the average per capita housing wealth in 2020 dollars, $161,508, with the number of African American residents in California in 1980, 1,819,281, yields a number of, I'm going to say this slowly, $293,828,435,748, or approximately $294 billion in 2020 dollars. That is the amount potentially what California would owe the eligible class in 2020 dollars just for redlining discrimination alone. Just for redlining discrimination alone, about $294 billion. If all 1,996,911 African American non-Hispanic Californian residents who live in the state in 2020 were eligible, although that's not the case, each would receive a housing reparations of up to about $148,630, or about $3,378 for each year between the years of 1933 and 1977. We use 1930 and 1980, spent as a resident of the state of California. A note on unhoused persons. Originally, the task force asked its economic experts to include housing discrimination calculations for the losses to African Americans in California experiencing homelessness. This, however, proved difficult for both conceptual reasons and lack of data. While housing discrimination is one major factor causing disproportionate African Americans experiencing homelessness in California, there are other factors. For example, from the late 1950s to the early 1980s, a movement for the deinstitutionalization and local care of the mentally ill coincided with the Reagan administration's cuts to social services. As a result, deinstitutionalization, or rather deinstitutionalized individuals suffering from mental illness and other conditions, swelled the rank of the unhoused population, not only in California, but nationwide. Owning a larger share of the real estate, it was easier for white households to absorb the effects of deinstitutionalization than it was for African American households. Another factor is the war on drugs that caused not only a massive disproportionate incarceration of African Americans, but also unemployment and housing displacement in many economically depressed African American communities. Once incarcerated, African Americans were eventually released. And we can see the discussion on Atrocity 2 that we talked about last week, mass incarceration and over-policing of African Americans, where we went through this same process of figuring out what the financial dollar amount figure losses are and were for mass incarceration and over-policing. So one approach to estimating reparations for African Americans experiencing homelessness caused by discrimination might be to establish the percentage of unhoused African Americans in California disproportionate to the percentage of African Americans in the California population, and then to multiply this number with the state average price of a one-bedroom apartment. This calculation would assume that the percent of African Americans in California who are unhoused would have been equal to the percent of white people who are unhoused, if not for the various forms of discrimination documented in Chapter 2 through Chapter 18 of this report. And then we got some more tables here. Okay, so that is going to end the part specifically talking about the housing discrimination. Okay, so what I want to do right now, actually, I want to stop here because that was a lot. The next part of this chapter goes into the next atrocity that we're going to do some math and put some numbers around that. And that atrocity is unjust property takings by eminent domain and probably some other ways too. So the next part of this chapter specifically talks about the atrocity, the harm, the very bad thing of unjust property takings, and how we calculate the numbers, the dollar figures of what we're owed as a people here in California, those of us who are descendants of U.S. slavery, what we're owed as a people as a result of these unjust property takings. So I want to stop here because I don't want to give you so much math that it's all fuzzy and you don't remember and retain any of it. Okay. So let's stop here. Next week, we'll pick up and we'll continue with atrocity number 4. And hopefully next week, we'll be able to, looks like we'll be able to actually next week go through atrocity number 5 as well. So we'll be able to finish. Wow, I'm looking at real formulas here, real math formulas. So we'll be able to go through atrocity number 4 and likely, hopefully, number 5 as well. But if we need to do another week and just do number 5 and finish with that, we'll take our time. We are in no rush. We are in no rush. And this chapter is only like 20 pages long. But as you can see, each section is heavy and it's a lot. So let's stop here with the housing figures and housing numbers and housing math and housing discrimination losses and how we put dollar figures on that. And let's pick up next week with doing the same thing. So it's going to feel like you're in class. It's going to feel like you're sitting in front of the teacher and in class and getting a math tutor, thing going, right? But this is some of the most important math that you're ever going to see. And to be honest with you, I've never seen this kind of math done ever. So sometimes we hear in the reparation space, well, how do you put a dollar figure on what happened to our people? Yes, it's hard to put dollar figures on some things. It's not hard to put dollar figures on other things. And hard or easy doesn't mean we ain't going to try. And we've done more than try here. these economists and the expert team, and whenever the chapter says expert team, they're talking about the economists that the task force hires. So these are the people who do this kind of stuff for a living. Dr. William Darity Jr., Thomas Kramer, William Spriggs, rest in peace, Dr. Casey Campbell, Kirsten Mullen. These are some of the experts that the task force work with to put these numbers together. And I've never seen any math like this. So I think we're literally looking at something, I may be wrong, but we're literally looking at something that's never been done before. Literally looking at putting dollar figures on what our people lost. And what's going to happen next is our state senators and our state assembly members will take what these numbers are and then put them into legislation to tell us how much we're going to get paid out, how much we're owed, how much checks are going to get cut, and how much they're going to be. And as we say in this movement, and as we say in this space, and as a part of this organization, what's the best way to say it? If it doesn't have direct compensation, it ain't reparations. So don't go anywhere yet, though. We're gonna close out, but don't go anywhere yet. Okay. So, of course, as mentioned, that will conclude tonight's reading of chapter 17, part 2, probably part 2 or 4 of the California Reparations Task Force's final report. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, like this video, hit that like button right now, smash that like button right now, hit the bell for reminders as well, and subscribe to this channel. We're working to get our YouTube channel up. We've been doing a lot of work on Instagram, a lot of work on Twitter, a lot of work on TikTok, a lot of work on Facebook over the years. We've just come to YouTube over the last year or so. So please help us get our YouTube channel subscribers up and our YouTube views up. Check out our videos, check out our lives, check out our YouTube shorts too. They usually do thousands of views. So check out our YouTube shorts. Also, when you go though, don't forget to get connected to us on social media, as I just mentioned, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and here on YouTube at CJC Official. That's at CJEC Official. We also want you to get and be and stay informed. To do that, we want you to visit www.cjec-official.org. That's cjec-official.org, and sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page. We have a newsletter that we put out pretty much every month. We have a text message blast list that goes out pretty much once a month or so now also. So sign up for those, and you can also sign up to volunteer and get involved. Support our work by volunteering. On that same Get Involved page, there's a box you can check that says, I want to volunteer. I'm interested in volunteering opportunities. Check that box. And you can also donate. We're all volunteers here at CJEC. We all have done this work for 4 years, maybe now, 4 or so years now, all because we want reparations to happen for our people. So please do donate, right? And I'm saying that as someone who donates myself pretty much every single month. So please do donate. And to donate, you can click the donate tab on the homepage of our website. A big special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsors, the California Black Women's Health Project. We are blessed to have the Black Women's Health Project be our fiscal sponsor. They handle all our donations. All of the donations, 100% of them go to us, go to CJEC, and support our work, whether it be, I'm going to grab this right now. I can show you. Printing out these amazing flyers. Hope it's not upside down. These amazing California reparations cards and info flyers, whether it be renting venues for our reparations community listening sessions or our reparations information sessions, et cetera, et cetera. All of the dollars go to the work itself. So please do donate. Again, hit that donate tab. Big shout out again to the California Black Women's Health Project. And you can learn more about our amazing fiscal sponsor at www.cabwhp.org. That's the California Black Women's Health Project, cabwhp.org. A big special thank you to you, Yes, you who are watching right now and listening right now. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your time. I don't take your time for granted at all. Keep in mind, as I said to start, we're going to re-record part 1 of chapter 17 because there was that clicking noise going on, and so I want to make sure that you have the most quality sound and audio possible. So we'll re-record part 1 of chapter 17. Don't worry about it. It won't be alive. You'll just open your eyes one day, go on YouTube, and you'll see part 1 uploaded of chapter 17. So that's coming soon. And so keep that in mind. This is part 2 of chapter 17. We'll continue with part 3 next week. We are closer to reparations than we've ever been in California. Family, have a great night.